All right, so this is the continuation of chapter 22. Last class we were talking a little bit about why Europeans were now expanding their influence. We've already talked about how they're going to Latin America. Here we're talking about them going to Africa, South Asia, East Asia. We said there were two main reasons for why they were doing this. Reason number one was trade. Good. You had me worried. And reason number two was, right, converting people to Christianity. And we talked about how they wanted to go to all these different places in East Africa, South Asia, East Asia, for a variety of trade goods. We talked about the three zones of trade, the Arab zone, the Indian zone, the Chinese zone. In each of those zones, there were particular luxury goods that the Europeans were interested in. And when they first showed up, what's the problem the Europeans have?
There's no centralized trading guild. There's no basic rules about trading. It's just free bartering.
Okay, so we've got multiple problems. We've got the fact that there's no central guild or organization running the trade. Stephen, what's another one? Europeans have nothing good to trade, which means they can't get into this barter system. Any other problems? Hannah? They speak different languages. It's hard to really trade well when you don't know the language of the people you're trading with, because then you can't really talk to them. Like, I bought a couple of fake watches when I was in Rome. It's like a fake Rolex. You know how hard it is to haggle when the only English the salesman spoke was numbers? Like, I can't argue about the value of the watch or how I'm not going to pay more because this thing looks crappy and it's not a real... He's like, 30. I'm like, no. Like, that's the extent of our bartering. He's like, you want this? Yeah. 70. No. 60. No. 50. Like, that's not really bartering. That's just like throwing out numbers until I nod my head. So you're right. Even something as simple as that makes it difficult for Europeans to trade. Especially since nobody wants their goods. Because nobody can tell them, man, look, your goods suck. Like, they're just holding up their iron pot and people are like, no. They don't know if that means too expensive. They don't know if that means I already have one and I don't need it, but thank you very much. They don't know if that means that thing sucks and nobody wants that. We wouldn't give that to our child to play with. Eventually, though, they hit upon a solution. And the solution is force. They find a way to take control of small sections of these trade areas and to use physical force or the threat of force to get what they want. And so we talked about how one of the ways that they do this is trade companies. You actually take land in that part of the world and you claim it. And so you would set up a trading fort in Calicut, a small enclosure surrounded by a gate, reinforced with cannons, guards on duty all the time, basically make it too much of a hassle for people to try to kick you out. And from there, you can now run your day-to-day options. Instead of sending a ship all the way from Europe to here, spending 1 or 2 days trading, not getting to know anybody, and then having to sail all the way back home. At least if you stay, you get to know the locals. You can maybe develop friendships. You can maybe learn the language. So that was the rationale behind trading companies. Now, they get crazy the later that they go. Once these things have been set up, they are so far from home. And the technology, especially communication technology, is so bad. What do you think starts to happen? And keep in mind, at first, the way that this is envisioned is that a trading company will always seek direction from the monarch of their country. So if the Portuguese set up a trading fort in India, anytime they want to do anything, they're supposed to send a letter to the King of Portugal saying, hey, here's the situation, what should we do? Put it on a ship, ship sails back to Portugal, Message gets delivered to the king. King looks at the message, makes his decision, puts the message back on the ship, sends the ship back to India, and the trading company gets their response. What do you think starts to happen? What's that? Who gets frustrated? So what are they going to start to do? Exactly. They're going to stop sending letters and do whatever seems right. Yeah. They're going to become very independent. And think about this. They have their own soldiers there. They have a fair amount of money there. They have whatever trade goods they're able to get on hand. This becomes like a mini country. And whoever is in charge of the trade company now is able to wield a fair amount of power. And so if they decide they want to start sinking a few ships, we're just not going to tell the king. If they want to make some sort of, treaty or negotiation with a ruler in India or one of the small island kingdoms, we're not really going to ask the king of Portugal. We're just going to do it and then tell him about it later. Be like, oh, your majesty, this great thing happened. It just fell into our lap. We couldn't help it. We had no choice. We had to say yes. And you guys see the Pirates of the Caribbean movie? Yeah. Okay. I forget if it was the second one or the third one, but the representatives of the British East India Company start to become major players in the whole Pirates of the Caribbean saga, and they're doing all kinds of things in the Caribbean that the King of England has no idea about. And they're just kind of running their own show because they're so far from home, nobody's going to find out. All right, so that's option 1. Options 2 and 3 don't give you nearly as much power or nearly as much profit, but there also isn't nearly as much violence. So option 2 is a tribute system. Now, who have we learned about before that uses tribute systems? China, Rome, the Mongols, Aztecs, Incas. So this is not a new idea. But it's a very effective idea because what you do is you threaten people with violence, especially if they're weaker than you. And then when they give in, you say, all right, out of the kindness of our hearts, we are going to let you keep your way of life. We're going to let you keep your leaders. All you have to do is pay us, bribe us, to avoid future violence. Now, since the goal is to give Europeans the stuff that they want, what if you come down to one of these little island kingdoms in the East Indies where they grow some of these spices that Europeans really desire? And let's say you go to the ruler of one of these little islands, like maybe Java. You say, look, I'm going to burn your palace to the ground unless you give me what I want, and I'm strong enough to do it. Actually, even at that time they weren't, but we'll just roll with it. And the king of Java's like, oh no, what do I do? Well, look, all you got to do is give me 20 pounds of, let's say, coffee. 20 pounds of coffee a month. No violence. We'll leave you alone. As long as the payments come, you and I can be the best of friends. Yeah, it's like what the mob does. It's like what the bully in the hallway does with the lunch money. Yeah. So as long as everybody plays nice, it works. The Europeans get the trade good that they want. They don't have to spend a lot of money fighting. Nobody on the other end has to die. It's a good system. Option 3 is you get them on your team. If you can convert them to Christianity, now you're brothers in Christ. You are part of the same religious tradition, practically related. Now, they're far more inclined to trade with you, and you're far more inclined to trust them because you share the same faith. Now, you can even use the religion itself as a trade good. Look, you give me coffee, I'll tell you more about Jesus. You give me cinnamon, and I'll help you build churches and bring you copies of the Bible. Now, what's the catch here? What's required to make this work? Missionaries. You have to get the people to agree to become Christian. And that's, as we've talked throughout the year, that's oftentimes a whole lot harder than just getting them to trade with you. You know, I'll trade you my water bottle for your Gatorade. That's one thing, but me taking your religion, that's not one of those like, oh yeah, sure, I could use that. Here, handshake. So the missionary activity promises to be really successful if you can get them to convert. Now, do you guys remember way back in chapter 17 we talked briefly about the Reformation? Martin Luther splitting up the Christian faith into new denominations, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, all that. One last thing to note about this missionary activity. It's being done almost exclusively by the Catholic Church. You're not seeing Lutheran missionaries coming to Asia, or Calvinists, or Anglicans. Only the Catholic Church had the financial means and the reach to send people halfway around the world. So the missionaries that people in China or India or Java are meeting are Catholic priests. And that's the version of Christianity that they're being exposed to. That's not good or bad, that's just kind of a heads up. Now, if you guys still have the chart that I gave you last class, we're going to talk briefly about how successful these missionaries were. We're going to take a look at who they targeted, how they were received, and whether or not Christianity really ever got a foothold in these countries. So you may want to take that out and take a peek at it. And for those that forgot it, we've got it on the next slide. So are we good to move to that? Yes? Yes? Okay. So we're really just going to look at 3 areas that the missionaries go to: India, China, and Japan. And again, you can look at this in more detail on your chart. But in each place, these Christian missionaries, these Catholic missionaries, have at least one, if not more, significant established religions that they're competing against. When they go to India, Hinduism has obviously been established for a long, long time, and even Islam has been around for 800 or 900 years at that point. Buddhism and Confucianism in China, Buddhism and Shinto in Japan. So it's not like Europeans going to Africa or Latin America, where those people would have had their religions as well for thousands of years, but they wouldn't necessarily have the same cohesion as these major world religions. Interestingly, early reaction to the missionaries in India, very little desire. In China, nah, they're a curiosity. It's like, look what I brought home today. It's a Christian missionary. Isn't that kind of fun? Let's eat dinner with him and listen to his crazy talk. And in Japan, it's totally politically motivated. Very little personal desire to convert, but seeing it as a great tool to help push back the political influence of the Buddhists. Now, you got to think, if the goal of this missionary activity is to help make trade easier, which social class are you going to focus your conversion efforts on? Yeah, the upper class, and maybe who else? The merchants, right? They couldn't get those in India. Because if you're part of the Hindu caste system, if you're a Brahmin or in the warrior and prince class, Are you going to touch Christianity? No way, dude. Why not? Because you're almost done. You're almost out. Are you going to take any chances with your karma at this point by experimenting with a new religion? It's like, are you begging to be an untouchable? No way. So they have some success with the lower caste Hindus, the people at the bottom, the untouchables, the peasants, the laborers, the people that would have levels and levels and levels yet to go. But very little success amongst the elites. Nick?
So is it the same results that Islam had when it came in?
Yeah, exactly. A very similar result to when Islam was brought over in the 700s and 800s. Hinduism had too much influence on society. It wasn't just a matter of personal choice, it's your place in the social hierarchy as well. You're going to see a very similar thing happen in China. Lots of lower class people whose lives suck and are encouraged by the prospect of live one life, and then when you die, according to these Christian missionaries, where do you go? Heaven. Well, we're not going to focus on the hell part so much, but look here. You could go to heaven. You could spend one crappy lifetime as a peasant and then spend the rest of eternity in paradise. You got to imagine peasants whose lives are just awful would really be interested in something like that. But for the elites who live in palaces with servants and nice food and nice clothes and all those comforts, to hear a Christian missionary tell them how bad their current lifestyle is and they need to give up those things and focus on the next life, it's not really surprising that the upper class people didn't really convert.
What about that thing that the upper class people would have more time and wouldn't want to mess up their faith to God? Or whatever.
Well, and that's true too. I mean, if you are upper class in whatever established system you're in, Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever, the usual logic went that you were closer to the end of your spiritual journey, so you don't want to mess with that. However, upper class people would have more free time available to truly study a new religion, and so they could conceivably convert at that point. But the early Christian missionaries are not going to find a great deal of success. They're going to be frustrated a lot. And one of the article that I'm going to give you today, once we're done, is the story of one of these Catholic missionaries in China. And you'll see the reception that they get and how the people treat them, and some trust them and some don't, and some are terrified that the Christians are just there to screw up society. And you'll see the influence that trade played in all this too, and how the desire for money really impacts the effectiveness of the missionaries. So it's kind of a fun read. In the end, though, especially early on, missionaries do not get a favorable review. In some cases, they're harassed, or even in the case of Japan at one point, they're actually persecuted. So this is in Nagasaki. One of the shoguns, and in his early rise to power, decided he wanted to rid his country of the influence of Europeans. And the missionaries refused to leave because they felt like they were doing the Lord's work, and they were trying to bring the Japanese people to faith in Christ, and they were not going to be kicked out of Japan because they still had work to do. And so Hideyoshi, the shogun at the time, decides to make a public example of these missionaries and show the people in Japan just how serious he was about getting rid of European influence. And I don't know if you can see it, but these are all crosses. And these are all the priests tied to the crosses. And they will all be crucified at the end of this event as a public statement of the shogun's displeasure with the Christian missionaries and European influence in general.
Now, was it a true crucifixion? Because I heard somewhere that it was not really a true crucifixion, but it was just they put him on the cross. And then
Yeah, it was more just an execution. Yeah. Yeah. So this is more just a statement of kind of the worst that it got for missionaries sometimes. Obviously, some of them were successful. Some of them dealt with only minor setbacks. But for some of them, it was a true test of their own faith to see how far they were willing to go to do the work that they had been called to do. Most of these are pretty intuitive, but we'll put it up here anyway. Reasons why people would convert. We've talked through a lot of these. You've probably thought of a lot of these on your own. If you're lower class, why do you convert? Why do you convert if you're a Hindu? Lower class in India, you're Hindu. Why would you convert to Christianity? Because what? Okay, would converting to Christianity and still living in India give you that freedom and respect? Okay. What would it give you? Sahil? Equality? So, like social equality or spiritual equality? Well, if you become a Christian in India, are the rest of the Hindus going to look at you and go, oh, wow, you're just like, the people at the top of the caste system? Or are they going to look at you and say, all right, you were an untouchable, just because you say you're a Christian, now we're still going to treat you like an untouchable? Probably that. So what do you get if you are lower class and convert to Christianity? What's the selling point? Jasmine? Hope for heaven. When do you get heaven if you're an untouchable Hindu? Long time, right? Lifetimes. Dozens of reincarnations. But if you're an untouchable and you convert to Christianity, when do you get heaven? That lifetime. When you die, that time, you go to heaven. Do you think that probably sounded a whole lot better than centuries of waiting? Probably. Now, sometimes if you're lower class, conversion isn't really an option. Especially if you're in some sort of feudal society where you are, under the influence of some sort of feudal lord or landlord. If your feudal lord converts to this brand new religion, what's the smart bet for you? Convert to. Because obviously if he's all gung-ho about this new faith and you're still doing the old way, what might happen? Persecution. I mean, at worst, you might not be treated as well as some of the people that do convert. But maybe you'd be punished. Maybe you'd be treated horribly. And for some whose lives were already bad, and again, if you're at the bottom of any of these social hierarchies, I mean, food is hard to come by, your shelter sucks, your clothing is pretty raggedy, you get sick a lot because you don't eat well, your children are malnourished. And so hearing about this loving God that takes care of his people, do you think that might be a huge selling point for people living in abject poverty? That here is a God who cares about you right now? Do you think that might convince some people to convert? Probably. Now, if you're upper class, why would you possibly give up the religion that you've had your whole life and is part of the reason why you are so successful? Why would you give that up and convert to something new? I mean, it's on the board. You can use that if you want. Stephen. Good. Now explain that. Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's brand loyalty. I mean, how many of you have stores that you go to because you love that brand? Right, many of you. And even if the store next door had the same kind of item but a different label on it, and it was a little bit cheaper, how many of you would still go to your store? Yeah, Yeah, you would. That's what the upper class people that convert are getting. They're getting a relationship with the Europeans, and especially as the Europeans become more and more powerful in trade, you want them on your side. You want them coming to you to trade, and not to your rival, not to your neighbor. So if you become Christian, they're more inclined to trade with you, and you're more likely to get their business. Now, option 2 is you want some of the stuff that Europeans have, especially firepower. And if you convert, they are more likely, the Europeans, are more likely to see you as a friend and someone that they could trust with their technology. Which means you get your hands on some cool toys. Or like we saw in Japan, if you've got a problem with one religion, the Buddhists were becoming too powerful. And why did they get powerful? Because they weren't taxed. So if the Buddhists are getting out of hand, bring in a new religion. Give people another option. Give them something else to focus on. It weakens the Buddhists and makes the emperor and the nobles more powerful. Or if the Europeans are knocking on your door going, look, if you don't convert, we're going to blow you up, what do? You convert. All right, reasons not to convert, again, pretty logical. First one being, you like your old religion. It works for you. It makes sense for you. Why change it? Well, yeah. Now, for peasants, why would you hang on to your current religion? Is any sort of conversion going to radically alter your current life? If you are a Hindu untouchable and you convert to Christianity, when you wake up the next day, are you living in a palace? Do you have food galore? Are you rich beyond imagination? No. Does your life still suck from a materialistic standpoint? Absolutely. So for some lower class people, they're looking at it going, why would I bother? Why would I convert? There's no point. For the elites, if you're at the top, why would you risk it? If you're a Hindu Brahmin and you are at the top of the hierarchy, why would you give that all up? And the flip side of an earlier point, if you convert to the Europeans' religion, what's guaranteed to happen?
They'll be attracted to you more.
Yeah, they're going to be attracted to you more, and they're going to keep coming. They'll be like that next door neighbor that knocks on your door every day and is like, hey, you want to play? You want to play? You want to play today? You want to come over? You're like, no, leave me alone. But you say yes once, and all of a sudden you can't get rid of them. I don't know if you guys had that growing up. When I was growing up, I had this one kid that lived in my block, just annoyed the crap out of me. Hung out with him once, and then for like 2 years, just like every day. You want to play? You want to play? You want to play? No.
Exactly, shave the beard.
That's like 2 weeks ago. Where have you been? All right. China in one page. Remember all those times we did like 8, 9, 12 slides on China? This is China in one page. How awesome is that? And you guys were just about to complain about like, God, there's so many notes. It's China in one page. All right, we have the second to last Chinese dynasty. Started by a peasant, which is kind of cool. A peasant rebellion leads to the formation of the Ming dynasty. They're the ones that kick out the Mongols, which again is a big day for China. What was the Mongol take on Confucianism and the bureaucracy? They didn't like it that much. So they kind of downplayed the scholars. They kind of downplayed Confucianism. So obviously, if you want to make China great again, what do? Bring back Confucianism, bring back the bureaucracy. How do you get people into bureaucracy? Civil service exams. So what are you going to bring back? Civil service exam. Now, have we had issues with dynasties in the past becoming corrupt? Yes. So, your book's going to give you a little bit more detail, but the Ming Dynasty is going to try to solve some of those reoccurring problems. Anybody want to guess whether or not they work?
They don't work because they're gone.
They don't work because they're gone. This part was kind of cool. How many of you have read chapter 22? Okay. I know you caught this then. What would they do to some of the government officials that would be embezzling money or making wrong decisions or things like that? Beat them publicly on the bare buttocks, which I believe is how your book phrases it. I mean, can you imagine, like, we take a senator out of session in Congress and we take him out on the steps of the Capitol building and we pull his pants down and beat him?
That would make politics a whole lot more interesting.
Oh, I mean, can you imagine? Could you imagine the nightly news? 5 o'clock news, leading story. Senator whatever his name, and like the camera's like zoomed in on. Wow. Wow. And that would be bad enough here, but in a nation like China, where your honor and your dignity are so much more valuable, can you imagine how humiliating this would be for public officials? I mean, you often hear the expression like die of shame.
They would die of shame. They would commit suicide.
Yeah, I mean, this would be punishment beyond compare. Yeah. Yeah. And so again, it seems like some of these things just might work and give China the chance to finally succeed where their dynasties have failed. But does it work? Anybody want to guess? No, it doesn't work. What's up? Like that? Okay. Now, in an attempt to mend some fences, to heal some relationships, you'll also see some of the emperors in this dynasty take wives from the lower class. So again, trying to show compassion. Offer hope. Can you imagine? I mean, and we hear this with China a lot. Which gender child did they prefer to have? Boys. But could you now imagine the hope that parents of female children would have? Like, even if you're in the peasant class and the emperor, comes riding through your region or whatever, like you'd have that moment of, right, like, look at my child, isn't she pretty? Look at her. Like, she could be the next empress. Like, that's like lottery times 12 million. Sahil? Well, not that she would like take money from the government's treasury and like, hey, mom and dad, psh, there you go. But, if she gets to move to the palace, they're going to see an improvement in their life. It's also this dynasty that funds the voyages of Zheng He. Do we remember him? All of his treasure junks. His excursion around the Indian Ocean. And then when he gets back, what happens to him? Right. We don't care, and you're fired. And then he dies. And then they eradicate him from history and tear down all his statues. American foods show up thanks to the Europeans. China's population booms. Emily? It happens during, well, they cancel his voyage in like 1438. So it's technically the post-classical era, but the Ming Dynasty splits both eras because they're coming to power at the end of the post-classical era through the early modern. Yes?
What does it mean when sons and dads talk
Okay, sorry. The sons exiled the provinces to prevent infighting. If the emperor has children and the children grow up in the palace, what's life going to be like for them? Easy. Luxury galore. The best food, the best clothing, sweet bedrooms, all of it. And that's oftentimes going to make the sons greedy and make them plot to overthrow their parents so they can hurry up and become the emperor and get even more power. So, how do you break that cycle? Well, you ship the kids off to the frontiers of China. Right. It's like boot camp. You're living in a tent. You're eating soldiers' rations. The possibility exists that you will die the next time the nomads or the barbarians or whomever try to raid across the border. Do you think at that point you're as likely to grow up to be a selfish, spoiled brat? Probably not.
Wouldn't it give them more power to actually get sympathetic troops and attack their royal capital?
But only, it might give them more influence, but only if you prove yourself to be a good leader. If you prove yourself to be a selfish, spoiled brat, not only will people not follow you, but you're probably going to get, taken out to the woods one night and not come back. Either way. All right, this is also when we see Neo-Confucianism reach its height. So treatment of women, what do we know happens to women with Neo-Confucianism? Foot binding. Laws for divorce favor men. At some points, women are not even allowed to end marriages regardless of abuse or neglect or anything like that. I mean, your husband could walk out, leave for 10 years, and you would still be married to him and not be allowed to get a new husband. What about treatment of children? This is another one that probably stood out if you read the chapter.
They were treated poorly. They treated like little
Yeah. Yeah, there was a teacher that actually executed a child for talking back. I want to teach in that school. What's that? Yeah, probably. The principal would have it, but So that goes completely against kind of what the idea used to be, where children are these precious treasures that need to be kept safe and protected and coddled and taken care of. Here it's like, kid, you better not talk back because I will end you. Eat your vegetables. Okay. Clean your room. Okay, should I clean yours too? Yes. James?
So basically it's like anything in class, like
Sleeping, not taking notes,
so if you're sleeping,
spilling things,
So basically if you sleep, you might not be able to wake up.
Right, the eternal sleep, as it were. Yeah. Or Max. All right, so we get to the bottom. It's not a surprise ending. It's the same old, same old. Internal corruption, government incompetence, bureaucracy gets too big. Power decentralizes and goes to the feudal nobles. We get peasant rebellions. We get warlord rebellions. We get another dynasty. Down the tubes. But it was fun while it lasted. Sahil? Well, some people would argue it's not their fault. Some of this just seems to be basic human nature. There just seem to be some genetically predisposed greedy people out there that want power and they want wealth and they will do whatever they have to do to get into a position where they can have both. And once they're there, it's kind of like, man, screw everybody else. I'm going to look out for me. And so you would see bureaucrats get into their positions in the government. And I could work really hard and stay up late and sacrifice to make the lives of the people easier. Or, since all this government money is coming across my desk, I could have really big lunches. And I could show up to work late and I could leave early and I could blame other people for my failings and get them fired. And I could continue to move up until I'm making a lot of money, and then I could do whatever I wanted. That seems to be some of what happens. Until you get, right, your bare buttocks beaten. And so that seems to be the case with not only China, but with governments and a lot of the civilizations that we've looked at. Like, until you can find a way to fundamentally fix the basic human nature of some people, you're going to keep getting the same problems over and over again. You guys have heard the adage, I'm assuming, power corrupts. Like, you're given power and some people just don't take it well. You're given wealth and some people just don't take it well. By the way, if you haven't seen it, that's porcelain, which is one of China's most valuable trade goods. Could you see why Europeans would want to get their hands on it? I mean, it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And you compare that to like their cast iron pots. If you are a noble, wouldn't you love to have this? Wouldn't this be great to show off to your friends? And if you have the money lying around, wouldn't you spend exorbitant sums of money to get this? Absolutely. Until your kids break it. All right, Japan in one slide. We covered a lot of this in chapter 13, so this is mostly review. You had the Taika reforms. Emperor tried to seize total power. It didn't work. The nobles fought back. The Buddhists became too powerful. Power was getting divided up. There was conflict. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, you have open rebellion. The warlords are fighting against the aristocrats who are fighting against the Buddhists, and eventually you end up with a feudal state. The emperor becomes a puppet. The aristocrats lose all their power. The Buddhists lose their influence. And the daimyo, those regional warlords, the feudal lords, seize political power. The most powerful of them takes the title of shogun. And so we have the period in Japanese history called the shogunate. And this is about when the Europeans show up. They did not pick a good time, because the shogunate was very, very focused on protecting Japan's identity. And so at first, when the Europeans show up, they've got a couple of things that the Japanese think are pretty cool. They've got clocks, which are kind of magical. I don't know about you guys, my grandparents had like one of those really big grandfather clocks. I was fascinated by that. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I'd just sit there for hours and watch it. Even cooler than that, though, the Europeans bring in firearms. What happens to the samurai when firearms show up? They become obsolete. Yeah, they become obsolete. Their years and years and years of training and practice with the sword are now not nearly as impressive when you can hand a gun to anybody and make them just as lethal. Yeah?
Didn't it take some time for the Japanese to realize the true power of the musket hand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, again, anytime you introduce a brand new weapon into a society, it's going to take a while to figure out how to really use it effectively. So for a while, it's a novelty. It's kind of cool. It's like, hey, shoot that thing over there without touching it. Okay. But with that trade comes the missionaries. Again, with Europeans, you didn't separate the two. Where the goods went, the missionaries went. You don't get one without the other. And so eventually, this leads to that scene that we saw earlier where the Japanese ultimately decide that they're better off without anything European. And so you kick out the Europeans, you persecute the remaining missionaries, and you shut the doors. And Japan chooses a path of isolation, where they cut themselves off from Europeans, even from China to an extent, and choose to develop on their own, without any sort of outside influence. Right, until Matthew Perry shows up in the 1800s. But even then, once they're able to kick him out, they will once again choose isolation. So we're going to see this theme repeat.
I didn't know they chose that.
Yeah, because that leads to their empire building. So it's not really, it's isolation from foreign influence. Because that's not long after that you're going to get their industrialization, and then you're going to have the Sino-Japanese War where they fight over Korea with China. You're going to get the Russo-Japanese War where they beat up on the Russians. And then before long, you have the Japanese Empire, and we're heading into World War II. All right, so this is the wrap-up of the remaining portion of the world that we hadn't touched on at the end of the early modern era. What are some trends that you're noticing across all these areas? Asia, Latin America, Africa. Guns. Guns is going to be one of the huge ones. I mean, we really can't understate how much influence firearms are going to have at this point, and the power that it's going to give, especially to who? Europeans. The people that build them and develop them and spend the most time focusing on them. Nick, what else?
It's also where Europeans go all over the world and start building it. They start to build empires.
Yeah. European expansion. I mean, this is the first time that we've really talked about Europeans being significant, is in this era. I mean, we've had fun talking about the Crusades and about Byzantium and about Rome, but I mean, this is on a global scale. That Europeans are now becoming not only significant, but powerful. You're going to find that we're not going to talk about China in the same sort of reverent way that we used to, where it's like, oh, it's China. China's the best. Like, we're not going to get that again for a while. Like, China's still going to be an amazing country. But when you look at the superpowers in the world, it's going to be heavily focused on Europe for a long time to come in history. Sahil? Yeah. And so hand in hand with that is the expansion of Christianity, which will become one of the first truly global religions. You know, Buddhism had spread throughout the eastern half of Asia. Islam had spread all over Africa and the Middle East and East Asia and even into Europe. But Christianity is one of the first religions to leave the Eastern Hemisphere and branch out, and the other religions will follow. Good deal. You guys are wicked smart.